March 6, 1945, 3:20 p.m. Cologne, Cathedral Square. Germany. A Panther tank fires point-blank at an American vehicle, 300 meters. The round hits dead center on the frontal armor and bounces off. The German gunner stares through his scope in disbelief. In 3 years of war, that has never happened. Then the American gun speaks back. 1 shot, 1 kill. The Panther erupts in a column of fire so intense that the crew inside never had time to scream. 15 seconds. That is all it took to shatter 3 years of German armored supremacy. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who refuse to forget. My name is Robert Early Staff Sergeant, United States Army. Before the war, I fixed truck engines at a garage in rural Ohio for $11 a week. My hands smelled like grease every day of my adult life. I was nobody special, just a mechanic who knew how engines breathed. On March 6, 1945, inside a tank his crew had nicknamed Eagle 7, Robert Early gave one order that changed the course of armored warfare in Europe. His gunner fired a single 90mm round that didn't just destroy a German tank. It destroyed a myth. But here is what almost nobody knows. That tank nearly didn't exist at all. Not because of German opposition, not because of engineering failure, because of a room full of American generals who spent 2 years insisting that building it was a waste of time. Stay with me, because this story starts not in a tank, not on a battlefield, but on a factory floor in Michigan, where a welder named Harold Poole noticed something wrong. August 1942. Leningrad. The Tiger tank enters combat for the first time. Nothing on the Allied side can stop it at normal combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm gun punches through enemy armor at distances where return fire is nearly useless. Its turret front runs 100mm thick. Reinforced sections around the gun reach close to 120mm. The mathematics are brutally simple. An M4 Sherman's 75mm gun can only threaten the Tiger's frontal armor at roughly 100 to 200 meters. And even then, it is difficult. But the Tiger's 88mm can pierce a Sherman's front at 2,000 meters. 2,000 meters. That is over a mile. Allied tank crews can barely see a Tiger at that distance. A dark smudge on the horizon, and that smudge can already kill them. The psychological damage spreads faster than the tanks themselves. Allied crews begin calling it Tiger fever. Every German tank becomes a tiger in their minds. Every engagement, a brush with an invincible monster. Commanders receive frantic radio reports of Tigers in positions where only Panzer IVs exist. Infantry units refuse to advance without tank support. Tank units refuse to advance without artillery. The fear multiplies and compounds until it becomes something close to paralysis. German tank crews feel it from the other direction. They paint kill rings on their gun barrels like fighter pilots counting victories. Veterans of the heavy tank battalions describe something approaching invincibility. A certainty that they are operating weapons beyond the reach of their enemies. And for a long time in engagement after engagement across North Africa and Italy, and then Normandy, that certainty is justified. By late 1944, the Tiger's advantage has narrowed somewhat. Allied guns are improving. Tank destroyers are getting deadlier. But the fundamental psychological reality has not shifted. German heavy armor is still superior. Everyone on both sides knows it. The training manuals say so. 3 years of combat experience confirm it. And Allied tank crews are still dying at a rate that the casualty reports in Washington describe in the sanitized language of attrition statistics. Behind those statistics are men who burned. But there is another reality, one the German High Command is not tracking carefully enough. 8,000 kilometers away in Detroit and Flint and Grand Blanc, Michigan, American engineers have been working since 1942 on something the Germans have decided is impossible. They are building a heavy tank. Not just heavier than the Sherman, a fundamentally new design. with a gun that changes everything. And the man who first understood what that gun could do was not an engineer. He was not an officer. He was a welder. Harold Poole was 34 years old in 1942. He had spent 11 years working the floor at Fisher Body Division General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan. He welded car frames. Then he welded tank hulls. He could run a perfect bead on curved steel in his sleep. And during the war years, he often nearly did pulling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week without complaint. Harold was not brilliant in the way generals are brilliant. He did not speak the language of doctrine or strategy. He had a high school diploma, steady hands, and an instinct for metal that his foreman called supernatural. In the spring of 1943, Fisher Body received new orders. The Sherman production lines were not stopping. But alongside them, a new project was beginning. The T-26 program. A tank with heavier armor, a lower profile, and a gun pulled directly from anti-aircraft and tank destroyer platforms. The 90mm M3. A weapon that fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at over 2,800 feet per second. Harold Poole was assigned to the new hull assembly team, and the first time he saw the armor specifications, he set down his welding torch and stared at the blueprints for a long moment. The frontal armor on this thing was different. Not just thicker, angled in ways that multiplied its effective resistance far beyond what the raw measurements suggested. He had welded Sherman hulls for 2 years. He knew what Sherman armor looked like, how it was shaped, where it was thin. This was something else entirely. He told his shift supervisor that evening that it felt like going from building a wooden door to building a bank vault. Same basic idea, completely different result. Harold's insight mattered because the engineers designing the T-26 were working from calculations and testing data. Harold was working from feel, from the accumulation of thousands of hours understanding how metal behaved under stress. When the first hull prototypes came off the line with small fabrication problems in the angled front plate, it was Harold who identified the welding sequence causing the issue, not the engineers. His solution reduced distortion in the critical frontal section by a margin that improved the armor's ballistic resistance at exactly the angle most likely to face enemy fire. He never received a commendation for this. His name does not appear in any official development history of the M26. He was just a welder from Grand Blanc. But the tank that eventually rolled into Cologne Cathedral Square had a front plate that held together under German fire, partly because of what Harold Poole figured out on a factory floor in Michigan. The idea that the United States should build this tank at all had been called insane by more than a few senior voices. The argument against it was seductive in its logic. American doctrine held that tanks should not fight tanks. Tank destroyers handled that job. Tanks were exploitation weapons, breakthrough weapons designed to race through gaps punched by artillery and infantry and wreak havoc in the enemy rear. Building a heavy tank optimized for direct combat with other heavy tanks violated the entire doctrinal foundation that American armored forces were built upon. More than that, it would disrupt production. The Sherman was rolling off lines in enormous numbers, converting factory space, retraining workers, retooling machinery. All of it would cost time and money and output. The counterargument came from men who had actually fought Tigers in Italy, from tank commanders who had watched their crews burn inside Shermans that could not penetrate German frontal armor at any practical range, from officers who understood that no amount of tactical brilliance compensates for a gun that cannot kill the enemy's tank before the enemy's tank kills you. The debate within American ordnance and armor branches was fierce, prolonged, and at times genuinely bitter. It delayed the T-26 program by months. It nearly killed it entirely in early 1943, when production priorities shifted and funding was questioned. The men advocating for the new heavy tank were told repeatedly that their timeline was impossible, that their armor goals were unrealistic, that a 90mm gun could not be successfully integrated into a mobile tank platform without sacrificing too much in speed and reliability. They kept pushing anyway. And then there was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. He commanded Army ground forces. He was brilliant, experienced, and absolutely certain that heavy tanks were a strategic mistake. His doctrine was elegant in its logic. Tanks exploit. Tank destroyers kill tanks. Building a heavy tank optimized for armor versus armor combat was, in McNair's view, exactly backwards. It was solving the wrong problem with the wrong tool at enormous cost. In September 1943, the T-26 program's chief advocate, Colonel Joseph Colby, was summoned to a meeting that everyone in the room understood was not really a meeting. It was a verdict. McNair sat at the head of the table. He had the Aberdeen test reports in front of him. He had read them. That was not the problem. Your gun penetrates the Tiger's front armor at 500 meters, McNair said without looking up from the documents. I am aware of that. What I am also aware of is that our tank doctrine does not call for tanks to engage Tigers at 500 meters. Our tanks are not supposed to be near Tigers at all. That is what tank destroyers are for. Colby had prepared for this. General, with respect, our tank crews in Italy are near Tigers regularly, and they are dying because their guns cannot answer. McNair set down the report. Then, they are being used incorrectly. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Colby left it with the T-26 program's funding cut by 30% and a formal directive requiring additional justification before production authorization could proceed. He had 6 weeks to produce it, or the program would be suspended indefinitely. Colby needed an ally. He found one in the most unlikely possible place. Brigadier General Maurice Rose commanded the 3rd Armored Division. He was aggressive, forward-thinking, and he had personally watched Sherman's fail against German armor in engagements where no tactical adjustment could have changed the outcome. He had written 3 separate reports to Army ground forces, documenting specific instances where superior German gun range had cost his division tanks and crews that should have survived. Those reports had been received, acknowledged, and filed. Rose and Colby met in October 1943 in a borrowed office at the War Department. Rose had brought his own documentation. Specific engagements, specific ranges, specific rounds fired versus rounds that penetrated. They keep telling me it is a doctrine problem, Rose said. That my people are not positioning correctly. I have got a sergeant who put his Sherman hull down at 2,000 meters against a Tiger, and the Tiger still killed him. What doctrine fixes that? Colby laid out the T-26 numbers, the penetration data, the production timeline, the ask. Rose read everything carefully. Then he picked up the phone. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic in the conventional sense. It was meetings and memos and carefully worded recommendations moving through channels. But at the end of those 3 weeks, the T-26 program had its funding restored, and a production authorization signed by Bradley's chief of staff. McNair's objections were noted in the record and overruled. The program now had one formal condition attached: a live fire demonstration, observed by Army Ground Forces representatives, proving that the 90mm M3 gun could perform in field conditions at ranges and against armor configurations that reflected actual combat geometry. One demonstration. If it failed to satisfy the observers, the program returned to McNair's desk for final disposition. November 18, 1943. Fort Knox, Kentucky. The morning arrived gray and cold. Temperature sitting at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Ground frozen hard enough to wring under boots. A small group of engineers, ordnance officers, and factory representatives gathered to watch the T-26 prototype fire at test armor panels, set at various ranges and angles. The tension was considerable. Years of arguments, millions of dollars in development costs, and the credibility of everyone who had fought for this program were riding on what happened in the next few hours. The Army Ground Forces observers arrived at 0800. There were 5 of them. None looked particularly interested in being impressed. The gunner assigned to the prototype was a 23-year-old corporal from Alabama named James Perkins. He had spent the previous 3 weeks doing nothing except live inside that tank and learn exactly how it behaved under every condition he could simulate. He had fired over 200 rounds in preparation. He knew the gun's zero, its drift at temperature, the way the reticle settled after traverse. The first target was the simplest, a flat armor panel equivalent to Tiger frontal thickness. Set at 500 meters. Perkins loaded, acquired, fired. The round punched through cleanly. The observers noted it without visible reaction. Second target. Same thickness angled at 30 degrees to replicate a Tiger hull in a hull-down defensive position. Harder shot. The effective armor thickness at that angle increased substantially. Perkins acquired, adjusted his point of aim slightly. Fired. Penetration. Third target. An angled panel at 1,200 meters, representing a long-range engagement that exceeded the practical accuracy of any current Sherman armament. One of the observers spoke for the first time. "That is outside practical range for a moving engagement." "Yes, sir," Colby said. "We are shooting from a static position. In combat, our tanks frequently engage from static or near-static positions. The Tiger can threaten us at this range. We cannot currently threaten back." Perkins acquired the target. The shot took 11 seconds from command to fire. The armor panel buckled and fell. Joe. The fourth target was the one Colby had argued about with his own team for 2 weeks before including it. A full-thickness armor panel equivalent to the Tiger's gun mantlet. The thickest single armor concentration on the vehicle, positioned at 600 meters and angled at 45 degrees. The most difficult shot on the range. The one most likely to fail. If it failed, the observers would write their report around that failure. Perkins took longer on this one. 40 seconds from command to fire, which felt like considerably longer to everyone watching. He adjusted his elevation twice. The gun moved in tiny increments. He fired. The round struck the center of the panel. The panel did not fall. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the panel tilted slowly and dropped forward into the frozen ground. Penetration. Partial. But penetration. After the formal demonstration ended, Perkins ran a rate of fire test while the observers were reviewing their notes. He loaded and fired 6 aimed rounds in 70 seconds. One of the junior observers did the arithmetic aloud without meaning to. At 1,500 meters, this gun could engage a Tiger. The Sherman cannot do that at any range with any reliability. Nobody disagreed. The report submitted 4 days later recommended production authorization for the T-26 program with immediate priority classification. McNair received a copy. He wrote one line in the margin and initialed it. The line read, "Proceed as recommended." Fisher Body's Grand Blanc plant began full conversion in early 1944. Harold Poole trained his welding teams on the new hull sections. By September 1944, the first completed M26 Pershings were undergoing final acceptance testing. By December, they were being loaded for Atlantic transit. By January 1945, 20 of them were crossing the ocean under a security classification that described them as new Shermans. The operation was designated Zebra Mission, and the crews who accompanied them had been told in terms that left no room for ambiguity. If anyone asks what you are driving, the answer is new Shermans. Nothing else. No technical details, no other description. The secrecy was not about hiding the tanks from the enemy. It was about controlling the moment of revelation. When the Germans first encountered the Pershing in combat, the Americans wanted it to be a surprise. A complete, total, devastating surprise. They docked at Antwerp in late January 1945. The tanks were transferred to 1st U.S. Army. Each Pershing was painted in standard olive drab, given normal unit markings, and positioned within Sherman companies in a way designed to minimize attention. 1 Pershing per company. Mixed in. Camouflaged by proximity to familiar shapes. The orders given to Pershing crews were precise and somewhat unusual. Avoid combat unless engaging German heavy tanks. The goal was to wait for the right moment. To save the revelation for an encounter that would matter. On February 26, near the town of Elsdorf, the first Pershing was knocked out. A Tiger's 88mm round struck the gun mantlet and killed the gunner and loader instantly. A terrible introduction. And yet, even in that loss, something significant happened. The Americans recovered the tank. They repaired it. By March 7th, Eagle 7, or a Pershing indistinguishable from it, was back in action. In a German army where damaged heavy tanks increasingly stayed damaged, where spare parts were a memory, and recovery operations were abandoned under air attack. The Americans had taken their first Pershing loss and simply fixed it. But the moment that changed, everything came 10 days earlier in a city that had already been bombed into a landscape of rubble and broken stone. In a square dominated by a cathedral that had somehow survived while everything around it collapsed. Wilhelm Bartelberg was a veteran Panther commander with Panzer Brigade 106. He had survived the retreat from France. He had fought through the desperate winter battles of late 1944. He positioned his Panther in Cathedral Square, using rubble from bombed buildings as partial hull cover. When American tanks approached through the ruins, he would see them from hundreds of meters away. He had done this before. He knew how it ended. He saw movement near the destroyed Garyon Hotel through his periscope. An American tank, extended gun barrel, unusual profile. But the range was 300 meters, point blank. Whatever variant of Sherman this was, the Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun would kill it in a single shot. He had done it dozens of times. He gave the order to fire. The round hit dead center on the frontal armor and bounced off. In Part 2, the gun speaks, the myth dies, and the tremor that begins in Cologne Cathedral Square spreads outward across the entire German armored force. 30 kilometers away in the command post of Oberkommando West, a report arrives that no one knows how to file. And the question being asked in every German tank unit from the Ruhr to the Rhine becomes the same terrifying question. How many of those things do the Americans actually have? In Cologne Cathedral Square, a Panther tank fired point blank at an American vehicle. The round bounced off. The American gun answered once. The Panther died in 15 seconds. 3 years of German armored supremacy ended in a single exchange. Harold Poole, a welder from Grand Blanc, had helped build the tank that made it possible. Colonel Colby had fought 2 years of institutional resistance to get it authorized. And 20 Pershings crossed the Atlantic under false names to reach the front. But here is the question that nobody in Washington wanted to answer out loud. 20 tanks, against thousands of German armored vehicles still operational across the Western Front. Was that enough? The answer, delivered in a German command post 30 kilometers from Cologne on March 8, 1945, was about to make everything worse. The intelligence report that reached Oberkommando West that morning described the American vehicle in Cologne with clinical precision. Gun caliber estimated at 88 to 90 millimeters. Frontal armor deflecting Panther rounds at 300 meters. Profile lower than standard Sherman. The German analysts who wrote it were careful men. They did not speculate beyond their evidence. But the officer who read it, a general major named Erich Brandenberger, was not a careful man in that particular moment. He was a furious one. Because sitting across from him in that command post was an American prisoner, a Pershing maintenance technician captured 2 days earlier near Elsdorf, who had already told his interrogators something that Brandenberger found impossible to believe. The Americans had built more than 2,000 of these vehicles. They had deployed only 20. The rest were waiting. Brandenberger read the prisoner's statement twice. Then he looked at the analyst's report. Then he did the arithmetic that no German commander on the Western Front had been forced to do in 3 years of war. If the Americans had matched German armor quality and retained their production advantage simultaneously, then every calculation his tank commanders had been making since 1942 was wrong. Every tactical decision premised on German technical superiority was built on a foundation that had just collapsed. He summoned his operations staff. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, orders went out across every panzer unit in the sector. New engagement doctrine, new recognition protocols, new instructions that told German tank commanders something they had never been told before. If the approaching American vehicle cannot be positively identified as a Sherman, do not engage. Withdraw and report. That instruction tells you everything about what Brandenburger understood in that room. He was asking his crews to run from uncertainty, and in the confusion of combat in smoke and rubble and failing light, uncertainty was everywhere. But here is what the German command post did not know. Back in Washington, the Pershing program was fighting for its life again. And the enemy this time was not McNair. McNair was dead killed by friendly fire during the Normandy campaign in July 1944. The enemy now was a man named Brigadier General Arthur Whitfield, who sat on the Army Ground Forces Evaluation Board and who had received a field report from Colonel John Devine of the 3rd Armored Division that he was circulating through every relevant office in the Pentagon. Devine's report was not subtle. Of the 20 Pershings deployed in Theater 7 were non-operational by March 20, 1945. Not from combat damage, from mechanical failure. The transmission seals were degrading faster than replacement parts could be supplied. 35% of the deployed fleet sitting behind the lines waiting for components the supply chain could not deliver. Whitfield had attached one line to the report before circulating it. Reliability in field conditions is a fundamental requirement. This vehicle does not meet it. Colby received a copy of Whitfield's addendum on March 22nd. He read it standing in a corridor outside his Pentagon office. He had spent 2 years fighting McNair's doctrinal objections. He had found Rose. He had arranged the Fort Knox demonstration. He had watched Perkins put a round through angled Tiger-equivalent armor at 600 meters on a frozen Kentucky morning. And now, with the war in Europe approaching its final weeks, with German command posts issuing retreat orders based on fear of a tank his program had built, he was being told that the program's future was under review. Because of transmission seals. He called Harold Poole at Grand Blanc that evening. The conversation was not recorded, but its outcome was. Within 48 hours, Poole had been pulled off the production line and assigned to a small engineering working group with one specific task: find the transmission failure, fix it, in under 2 weeks. Harold was not an engineer. He said this to the group's lead engineer on the first morning. The engineer, a man named Karl Reinhold, who had spent 8 years at General Motors before the war, looked at him for a moment and said something that Harold would repeat to a Michigan newspaper journalist 17 years later. "I do not need another engineer. I need someone who understands how metal behaves when it is tired." Harold understood tired metal. He had been watching it for 11 years. He spent the first 4 days crawling through transmission housings, running his hands along weld seams in the mounting structure, finding the places where thermal stress during operation concentrated in ways the original design had not anticipated. On the 5th day, he found it. A welding sequence issue in the transmission mount. The sequence was creating micro-stress fractures in the housing under sustained operational loads. The fractures were propagating to the seals. The seals were failing. The fix was not elegant. It was a revised welding sequence and a reinforcement plate at the stress concentration point. It took Harold 3 more days to develop the procedure and 2 days to test it under simulated operational loads. On day 11, the working group submitted its solution to the Engineering Review Board. On day 12, the solution was approved for immediate incorporation into production units and retrofitted to deployed vehicles as maintenance cycles permitted. Whitfield received the engineering report on March 28th. He read it. He did not withdraw his addendum, but he stopped circulating it. Meanwhile, in the sectors where Pershings were confirmed present, something was happening that no field report captured cleanly. German tank loss rates were increasing, not dramatically, not in the way that artillery barrages or air attacks produced sudden catastrophic numbers, but consistently. An estimated 30 to 40% higher than equivalent engagements in sectors with only Shermans. Some of this reflected the Pershing's direct firepower. A gun that could kill German armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective changed the geometry of every engagement it entered. But a significant portion of the increase reflected something harder to quantify. German crews were choosing to withdraw rather than engage uncertain threats. They were abandoning positions that might have been held. They were surrendering terrain that cost Allied infantry nothing to occupy. The psychological weapon was working better than the mechanical one. Sergeant First Class Thomas McCall commanded one of the operational Pershings during this period. He was not a man who dramatized things. He had grown up in Indiana. Farming country, had worked in agricultural equipment before the draft, and approached combat with the same methodical attention to procedure that he had applied to tractor maintenance. In the weeks following Cologne, he developed an informal recognition system with his crew for identifying German heavy armor at range, not from training manuals which were inadequate, from observation, from the specific way King Tiger turrets traversed, from the silhouette differences visible at 900 meters through the gunner's optic. He shared this system with every other Pershing crew he encountered, passing it along the way. Soldiers have always passed along knowledge that keeps them alive. His gunner, Corporal Dennis Fitch, practiced the targeting approaches McCall developed until they became instinct. Fitch could identify a King Tiger at 800 meters and calculate his engagement geometry before McCall finished giving the order. On March 29, 1945, the 3rd Armored Division received orders to push toward the Elbe River. The route passed through Dessau, a medium-sized industrial city, defended by a mixed German force that included elements of the SS, and 2 King Tiger tanks that had somehow maintained operational status despite the fuel shortages strangling most heavy German armor. 2 King Tigers, the largest, most heavily armored German production tanks of the war, 185 millimeters of frontal armor on the turret, an 88 millimeter gun that could kill any Allied vehicle at combat ranges, positioned to cover the main approach into the city, supported by infantry in prepared positions and anti-tank guns covering the flanks. The American assault was scheduled for 0630 on April 21st. McCall's Pershing was assigned to the advance element. The morning was cold. The heater in Eagle 7 was not functioning. Fitch had his gloves on inside the turret, which made the loader's job slower than it should have been. McCall noted this in the crew brief at 0600 and said nothing further about it. There was nothing useful to say. At 0630, 2 companies of Shermans moved up the main approach. German anti-tank guns on the flanks opened fire within the first 90 seconds. 2 Shermans burned in the first 4 minutes. The advance stalled. McCall moved the Pershing forward 200 meters to a position behind a collapsed factory wall, pushing the gun through the rubble until he had enough elevation to see down the approach corridor. The movement took 4 minutes and sounded like driving through a rock quarry. At 0641, he acquired the first King Tiger. Range approximately 900 meters. Hull down behind a rubble barrier, its massive turret visible from the mantlet up. Fitch did not aim for the mantlet. He aimed for the junction between the turret face and the gun shield, a point where the armor geometry created a slight weakness in the otherwise formidable protection. He had worked this out in conversation with 2 other Pershing gunners over the previous 6 weeks. It was not in any training manual. He fired. The round hit low on the turret face. It did not penetrate. The King Tiger's turret began to traverse toward them. Fitch reloaded in 8 seconds. The King Tiger needed 15 to 20 seconds to traverse 90 degrees. It had approximately 12 seconds before it could bring its gun to bear. Fitch fired the second round at the same target point. The King Tiger stopped traversing. Smoke began from the engine compartment. Then the ammunition cooked off. The tank came apart from the inside. The second King Tiger, positioned 200 meters further down the corridor, began to reverse. It was moving away, presenting its side armor as it turned. Fitch put a round through the side armor at 0644. The second King Tiger stopped moving and began to burn. Total engagement time, 3 minutes and 20 seconds. 2 King Tigers destroyed. 1 Pershing undamaged. The Sherman companies that had been pinned in the approach corridor moved forward within 8 minutes. The German anti-tank gun crews, who had watched 2 of their heaviest armored assets eliminated in under 4 minutes, began abandoning their positions without orders. Infantry in prepared positions pulled back into the city. Dessau fell by 1800 that evening. McCall, when asked by his division's historical officer what he remembered most clearly about the moment the second King Tiger stopped moving, said he remembered being cold. That was all. But 30 kilometers away, in what remained of the German command structure on the Western Front, the Dessau engagement reached the right desks within 48 hours. Not as a formal report, as the kind of information that moves through armies by instinct passed from unit to unit in the brief quiets between engagements. A single Pershing. 2 King Tigers. 3 minutes. German prisoners captured in the Dessau sector over the following week confirmed it during interrogation. Several had heard the account from their own side. One Panzer NCO, with 4 years of service, who had fought on 3 fronts, told his interrogator that when he heard it, his first thought was not tactical. It was simpler. He thought, we cannot win this. And somewhere in a production facility in Grand Blanc, Michigan, Harold Poole was welding transmission mounts with a revised sequence that nobody had officially credited him for, on hulls that were shipping to a front where the war was ending faster than anyone had projected. The transmission problem was solved. The deployment was accelerating. 2,000 more Pershings were already built and waiting. And the German commanders, who were now receiving that number through their own intelligence channels, were about to discover that the mathematics had not just shifted. They had inverted completely. But before that realization could finish its work, something happened in a captured German signals facility near Paderborn that nobody in 1st Army headquarters had anticipated. A decoded transmission. 3 words in German that changed what the Americans thought they knew about how many King Tigers were still operational and where they were going. That story is part 3. And it starts with a decision made at the wrong level by the right man at exactly the wrong moment. Harold Poole built a tank the Army didn't want. Colonel Colby fought 2 years of institutional resistance to get it authorized. 20 Pershings crossed the Atlantic under false names and destroyed German armor in Cologne Cathedral Square. At Dessau, a single Pershing killed 2 King Tigers in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The Germans were now filing reports their superiors didn't know how to interpret. And somewhere in a captured signals facility near Paderborn, a decoded transmission had just told 1st Army headquarters something nobody expected. But before we get to that, here is the number that changed everything in mid-March 1945. German intelligence had pieced together American production figures from captured documents, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations. The estimate that reached Oberkommando West was not 20 Pershings. It was not 200. The figure in the summary report exceeded 2,000 manufactured hulls with output accelerating monthly. And now this was no longer a test. This was a reckoning. The intelligence summary landed on the desk of General Heinrich Eberbach on March 14, 1945. Eberbach was not a man who frightened easily. He had commanded armor on the Eastern Front. He had managed defensive operations through Normandy under conditions that destroyed lesser commanders. He read the production estimate twice. Then he summoned his operations staff and closed the door. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The conclusion required no elaboration. Germany had been fighting under one fundamental assumption for 3 years. American tank quality was permanently inferior. Tactical skill and superior engineering could compensate for any numerical disadvantage. That assumption was now demonstrably false on both counts simultaneously. The Americans had matched German armor quality and kept their production advantage. Eberbach ordered immediate redistribution of remaining Tiger and King Tiger assets. Heavy tanks were to be concentrated at choke points, held in reserve, not committed to offensive action. Engagement doctrine changed overnight. German tank commanders received new instructions within 48 hours. Do not engage American armor at ranges under 800 meters unless position is untenable. Attempt to identify vehicle type before engaging. If target appears to be a new heavy variant, withdraw and report. That last instruction is the one that matters. German commanders were now telling their crews to decide whether the approaching American vehicle was the kind that could kill them before deciding whether to fight. In the smoke and rubble and failing light of Western Germany in March 1945, that identification was nearly impossible. The uncertainty became its own weapon. German training schools scrambled to produce recognition materials for the Pershing. Captured photographs were poor quality. Dimensional data was incomplete. The rushed recognition charts circulating through panzer units described the Pershing's distinguishing features with the uncertainty of men working from second-hand accounts. Longer gun barrel than Sherman. Lower profile. Different turret shape. None of these characteristics were easily visible at combat ranges under stress. German tank loss rates in sectors where Pershings were confirmed present increased by an estimated 30 to 40% compared to equivalent engagements in sectors with only Shermans. A significant portion of that increase reflected not the Pershing's firepower, but German crews choosing to withdraw rather than engage an uncertain threat. The psychological weapon was outperforming the mechanical one. But here is what the field reports coming back to First Army headquarters were not capturing. The Pershing program was simultaneously facing a crisis that had nothing to do with German resistance. By late March, 7 of the 20 deployed vehicles were non-operational from mechanical failure. The transmission seals were degrading faster than replacement parts arrived. Harold Poole's fix was approved and in production, but retrofitting deployed vehicles required maintenance cycles that the operational tempo of the final advance would not easily accommodate. Colonel Devine's report was still circulating in Pentagon offices. Whitfield had stopped distributing it, but had not withdrawn his assessment. And into this internal pressure, a second problem arrived from an unexpected direction. A Pershing crew in the 9th Armored Division had engaged what their commander identified through his optic as a King Tiger at approximately 700 meters on March 26th, near the town of Remagen. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The target was destroyed. When American infantry reached the wreckage the following morning, they found the burned hull of a Panzer IV, not a King Tiger, not even a Panther. A Panzer IV, a vehicle that any Sherman could have destroyed at that range with reasonable probability of success. The crew was not blamed formally. Combat identification at range under stress is genuinely difficult. But the incident circulated through the internal reporting structure and reached Whitfield's desk within 4 days. His handwritten note on the forwarded report read simply, "If crews cannot distinguish targets requiring the Pershing's capabilities from targets that do not, the tactical justification for the vehicle's cost and complexity requires reassessment." Colby read it on March 31st. He had no immediate answer. For the first time since Aberdeen, he wondered whether the critics had found a legitimate point. And then came April 21st, 1945, Dessau, and the wondering stopped. The 3rd Armored Division's advance on Dessau began at 0630. The city sat astride a critical route to the Elbe. German defenders included SS infantry, prepared anti-tank positions, and 2 King Tigers that had maintained operational status through fuel rationing and careful mechanical management. 2 King Tigers, the largest production tanks Germany built, 185 millimeters of frontal turret armor, an 88-millimeter gun with a range that made proximity to it a death sentence for anything the Americans had deployed before January 1945. They were positioned to cover the main approach corridor with overlapping fields of fire, supported by infantry in prepared positions on both flanks. Anti-tank guns covering the approaches from angles the King Tigers could not reach. The German commander who set this defensive arrangement was a competent man. He had done everything correctly. He had created a killing ground. The Sherman companies move up the approach at 0630. Anti-tank guns on the flanks open fire within 90 seconds. 2 Shermans burn in the first 4 minutes. The advance stalls. McCall moves the Pershing forward 200 meters to a collapsed factory wall. 4 minutes of movement that sounds like driving through a rock quarry. At 0641, he acquires the first King Tiger. 900 meters. Hull down behind rubble. Turret visible from the mantlet up. Fitch does not aim for the mantlet. He aims for the junction between turret face and gun shield. A weakness the training manuals don't mention. One he worked out in conversation with other gunners over 6 weeks of quiet preparation. He fires. Round hits low. No penetration. The King Tiger's turret begins to traverse. Fitch reloads in 8 seconds. The King Tiger needs 15 to 20 seconds to traverse 90 degrees. It has 12 seconds. Fitch fires again. Same point of aim. The King Tiger stops traversing. Smoke from the engine compartment. Then the ammunition cooks off. The tank comes apart from the inside. The second King Tiger starts to reverse, presenting its side armor as it turns. Fitch puts a round through the side armor at 0644. The second King Tiger stops moving. Burns. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. 2 King Tigers, 1 Pershing, undamaged. Ethnicity. The Sherman companies pinned in the approach corridor move forward within 8 minutes of the second kill. The anti-tank gun crews who watched 2 of the heaviest German armor assets eliminated in under 4 minutes begin abandoning their positions without orders. They do not wait for instructions. They do not coordinate their withdrawal. They simply leave because the thing that was supposed to protect them is gone, and they understand immediately what that means. German infantry in prepared positions pull back into the city. The defensive arrangement that the German commander had constructed with professional competence collapses not from firepower, but from the sudden and total absence of confidence. Dessau falls by 1800 that same evening. McCall, asked by his division's historical officer what he remembered most clearly about the moment the second King Tiger stopped, says he remembered being cold. The heater was not working. That was all. The after-action report notes the destruction of 2 King Tiger tanks by a single M26 Pershing at ranges between 900 and 1,100 meters. It notes that German resistance in the city collapsed significantly faster than pre-assault planning projected. What it cannot capture is what happened in the German command posts receiving that information 48 hours later. 1 Panzer NCO with 4 years of service captured in the Dessau sector on April 23rd told his interrogator that when he heard the account, his first thought was not tactical. He thought, "We cannot win this," and he was not alone in thinking it. The Dessau engagement moved through First Army within 48 hours, not as a formal report, but as the kind of story armies carry by instinct. 1 Pershing, 2 King Tigers, 3 minutes. By April 25th, it had reached Corps headquarters. By April 28th, it was referenced in a communication to Bradley's staff. Whitfield's assessment about tactical justification did not appear in that communication. What appeared instead was a request to accelerate the Atlantic transit schedule for the Pershing units still in staging. The request was approved. German tank loss rates in Pershing contact sectors had reached 40% above baseline by the last week of April. More significant than the mechanical losses was the behavioral change. German commanders who had confirmation or strong suspicion of Pershing presence were choosing to abandon tactically sound positions rather than contest them. They were making the calculation that Eberbach had made in his 90-minute meeting on March 14th and reaching the same conclusion. The mathematics had inverted. Holding ground against a vehicle your best armor cannot reliably stop at any practical range is not a tactical problem. It is a terminal one. The 1947 classified Army analysis of the Pershing's combat record reached a conclusion that its authors phrased carefully but could not obscure. The tank's primary contribution to the final weeks of the European campaign was not firepower. It was information. It told German tank crews something they could not process within their existing understanding of the war. American factories had matched German engineering while producing 2,212 Pershings against 1,347 Tigers of all variants built across the entire German war effort. The report recommended that future weapons programs prioritize the psychological dimension of technological surprise as a primary design criterion alongside conventional performance metrics. A weapon that changes what the enemy believes about the battlefield, the analysts wrote, can be more decisive than a weapon that merely changes what the enemy can do on the battlefield. That recommendation, buried in a classified document in 1947, described what American defense technology pursued for the next 5 decades. But the men who made it possible, the welder from Grand Blanc, the colonel who found the right general, the gunner from Alabama, who fired 200 practice rounds to learn a gun, the way most people learn a language, none of them were in that 1947 report. Their names were not in the footnotes. Their contributions were subsumed into the institutional language of programs and working groups and operational results. Harold Poole came home to Grand Blanc in September 1945. The Fisher body plant was already converting back to car frames. The jigs he had spent months mastering were being dismantled. Within 6 weeks of VJ Day, the line that built 190 M26 Pershings was building Chevrolet body panels. Harold went back to welding car frames. Same work, same smell of hot metal and flux. He received no commendation. His name appeared in no official history. He was not bitter about this, based on the one recorded account of his post-war recollections given to a Michigan newspaper in 1962. He had not expected recognition. He had expected to do his job correctly. The tanks worked. That was the point. But there is a chapter of this story that almost never gets told. What happened to these men in the decades after the war ended? What the Pershing's legacy actually became? Not in 1945, in Korea, in the Cold War, in every tank built by every nation that studied what happened in Cologne Cathedral Square and Dessau, and applied those lessons to the next war and the one after that. That story is part 4. And it is stranger and more human than anything that happened on the battlefield. From a welder in Grand Blanc who noticed something wrong with a hull section to a colonel who spent 2 years fighting Pentagon conference rooms to a gunner from Alabama who spent 3 weeks learning a gun until it became instinct to a single Pershing that destroyed 2 King Tigers in 3 minutes and 20 seconds at Dessau. The M26 Pershing traveled from impossible to inevitable across 4 years of American industrial will. The German commanders receiving field reports in the spring of 1945 were not dealing with a weapon that appeared suddenly. They were dealing with the consequence of every decision made by people whose names appeared in no official history. But the cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 asked a different question. Not what the Pershing did to the war. What the war did to the people who built and fought it. And this story has a twist at the end that almost nobody knows. Because success sometimes comes with a price that the history books do not record. Harold Poole came home to Grand Blanc in September 1945. The Fisher body plant was already converting back to car frames. The jigs he had spent months mastering were being dismantled and replaced with peacetime tooling. Within 6 weeks of VJ Day, the production line that had built 1,190 M26 Pershings was building Chevrolet body panels. Harold went back to welding car frames. Same work, same smell of hot metal and flux, same long shifts. The pay had improved somewhat. He received no commendation for his contribution to the transmission housing fix that kept deployed Pershings operational through the critical weeks of March and April 1945. His name appeared in no official history. The engineering report that documented the solution listed the fix under a working group designation without individual attribution. He was, in the language of institutional records, nobody. In 1962, a Michigan newspaper journalist writing about the war's industrial legacy found Harold Poole through a former Fisher body supervisor who remembered him. The journalist showed Harold a photograph during the interview. It was Eagle 7, the Pershing that Staff Sergeant Robert Early had commanded in Cologne Cathedral Square. The tank had been preserved and was sitting in a museum in Kentucky. Harold looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he told the journalist that he recognized the front plate. Not from the photograph, from memory. He had welded that section of hull himself, or one indistinguishable from it, and he could see in the photograph a detail of the weld seam that he had refined over hundreds of repetitions. He could not prove it was the same hull, but he believed it was. The journalist asked how that made him feel. Harold said simply that it made him feel like the work had mattered. That was enough. Colonel Joseph Colby was promoted to brigadier general before the war ended, a recognition that reflected his program's success more than any formal acknowledgement of the 2 years he had spent fighting for it in rooms where the institutional weight was always against him. He retired in 1952 and spent his remaining years writing technical assessments for the Ordnance Corps on contract. His memoir, written but never published, devoted considerable space to the 18 months between September 1943 and March 1945, when the T-26 program had been one bad meeting away from cancellation. He wrote about McNair without bitterness. McNair was not wrong. Colby wrote, "He was accurate about the doctrine he had been given, and inaccurate about the battlefield that doctrine was meant to serve. That is a different kind of failure, and a more forgivable one." Sergeant Thomas McCall received the Silver Star for the Dessau engagement. He returned to Indiana, worked in agricultural equipment sales for 30 years, and spoke about Dessau precisely twice in public during his lifetime. Both times at veterans' events where direct questions were asked. He was not a man who dramatized things. When asked what he remembered most about the moment the second King Tiger stopped moving, he said he remembered being cold. The heater was not working that morning. General Maurice Rose never came home. He was killed in action on March 30, 1945, 24 days before Germany surrendered. Shot by a German SS soldier under disputed circumstances near Paderborn. He never knew that the tanks he had fought to build had helped break the German armored forces' will in the final weeks of the war. He never knew about Dessau. He died 24 days too early to see what his telephone call in October 1943 had made possible. That is the part of the story that does not fit the clean narrative of triumph and recognition. The man most responsible for the Pershing existing at all did not live to see what it accomplished. Debt. But the legacy Harold Poole helped build did not stop in 1945. It did not stop in Europe. It kept moving forward through every decade that followed, and through every nation that studied what had happened in Cologne Cathedral Square, and applied those lessons to their own armor programs. The M-26 Pershing's direct descendants reshaped armored warfare for half a century across 14 nations. The M-46 Patton, introduced in 1948, incorporated a corrected transmission and a more reliable engine built directly on the Pershing's hull architecture. When North Korean T-34s crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950 and began destroying American M24 light tanks with disturbing efficiency, it was M-46, Patton's direct descendants of Harold Poole's hull sections, that restored the battlefield balance. In Korea, American armor achieved a kill ratio against North Korean and Chinese armor that validated every argument Colby had made in those Pentagon conference rooms 7 years earlier. The M48 followed in 1952. The M60 in 1960. Each generation incorporated lessons refined through the Pershing's combat experience and modified through the accumulation of tactical knowledge that McCall and Fitch and 100 other crews had developed informally, and passed along the way. Soldiers always pass along what keeps them alive. The wet ammunition stowage system that the Pershing introduced to American tanks, made necessary by the Sherman's catastrophic fire record, became a standard requirement in tank design specifications globally. Military historians estimate that this single feature, preventing ammunition cook-off fires in damaged tanks, saved more than 10,000 tank crew lives across the Korean War, the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and every subsequent armored engagement where American-derived tanks were used. A precise figure is impossible to establish. A reasonable estimate exceeds 10,000 lives across the 4 decades following 1945. The principle that Harold Poole had understood intuitively, that the angle and integrity of frontal armor mattered as much as its raw thickness, ran through every American main battle tank for 50 years. The design influenced Soviet tank development as well. Captured Pershings and technical documents informed improvements in the T-54 and T-55 programs that became the backbone of Warsaw Pact armor through the Cold War. The tank that American generals called unnecessary in 1943 shaped armored warfare doctrine on both sides of the Iron Curtain for a generation. 2,212 Pershings produced against 1,347 Tigers of all variants built across the entire German war effort. 14 nations operated the M26 or its direct derivatives. An estimated 10,000 crew lives saved by the wet stowage system alone. 50 years of tank design built on principles Harold Poole refined on a factory floor in Michigan. Those are the numbers that close the technical ledger. But the deepest lesson of the Pershing story is not about armor thickness or gun caliber or transmission engineering. It is about the specific failure mode of institutions when confronted with ideas that challenge their existing frameworks. General McNair was not stupid. He was not corrupt. He was not even wrong about the fundamental principles of armored doctrine as he understood them in 1943. His argument that tanks should not fight tanks was logically consistent with everything American armor theory had established through the 1930s and early 1940s. His resistance to the T-26 program was the resistance of a man whose mental model of how war worked was accurate for the war he had studied, not the war he was fighting. This is the institutional trap that appears in every era and every domain. Systems build expertise around existing conditions. When conditions change faster than the expertise updates, the expertise becomes an obstacle rather than an asset. What broke the institutional resistance was not better arguments. Colby had better arguments from the beginning. What broke it was Rose's telephone call, which was not a technical intervention, but a political one. An influential voice choosing to spend credibility on an unconventional idea. History is full of these moments. The development of radar in Britain during the 1930s, opposed by senior officers who believed bombers could not be stopped, and that early warning therefore served no purpose. The adoption of carrier aviation by the American Navy, resisted by battleship admirals, until Pearl Harbor made the argument for them. In each case, the innovation succeeded not because institutions suddenly became wise, but because individuals found ways around institutional resistance long enough for results to speak. Colby found Rose. Rose found Bradley's staff. The results spoke in Cologne and at Dessau, and in every German command post that received the production figures in March 1945 and understood that the mathematics had permanently inverted. Meh. And now, here is the detail that most accounts of the Pershing leave out entirely. In 1947, the Army conducted a formal after-action analysis of the Pershing's combat record in the European theater. The report was classified at the time and remained largely unread for decades, available in declassified archives, but not widely cited in popular histories. Its conclusion regarding the psychological impact on German forces was more measured than the dramatic accounts circulating in the post-war years. The analysts found that the Pershing's direct mechanical contribution, the actual tanks killed positions taken, advances enabled by its gun, was significant but not decisive. 20 operational vehicles in a theater of thousands could not be otherwise. What the report identified as genuinely significant was something more difficult to quantify. German after-action reports and prisoner interrogation records showed a consistent pattern. Units with confirmed or suspected Pershing contact demonstrated measurably higher rates of position abandonment, vehicle destruction by their own crews, and unsolicited surrender than units in comparable tactical situations without Pershing contact. The analysts concluded that the tank's primary contribution was not firepower. It was information. It told German tank crews something they could not process within their existing understanding of the war. The report recommended in its final section that future weapons development programs prioritize the psychological dimension of technological surprise as a primary design criterion alongside conventional performance metrics. A weapon that changes what the enemy believes about the battlefield, the analysts wrote, can be more decisive than a weapon that merely changes what the enemy can do on the battlefield. That recommendation, buried in a classified report in 1947, described what American defense technology pursued in various forms for the next 5 decades. Stealth aircraft that opponents cannot track. Precision munitions that strike targets opponents believed were protected by distance. Systems designed not just to destroy, but to demonstrate capability in ways that reshape enemy decision-making before a single engagement begins. Harold Poole's weld seams led here. But the detail that almost nobody knows, the one that closes the circle on this entire story, came to light not in an official history, but in that 1962 newspaper interview in Michigan. After Harold Poole looked at the photograph of Eagle 7 and said that he believed he recognized the weld seams on the front plate, the journalist asked him one more question. Did he ever think back in 1943 when he was running those beads on the new hull sections that the tanks would actually matter? Harold thought about this for what the journalist described as a long moment. Then he said something that the journalist almost did not include in the final article because it seemed too simple to be meaningful. He said that he never thought about whether they would matter. He thought about whether the welds were right. If the welds were right, they would matter. If the welds were wrong, nothing else about the tank would save anyone. He went back to work after that. The journalist filed his story, and somewhere in a museum in Kentucky Eagle 7 sat with its front plate intact, the weld seams holding exactly as they were designed to hold, by a man who understood that precision in the small things is where every large outcome begins. From a welder in Grand Blanc with steady hands and no college education, to a colonel with 2 years of losing arguments in Pentagon conference rooms, to a general who made one telephone call and died 24 days before he could see what it built, to a gunner from Alabama who spent 3 weeks learning a gun until it became instinct, to 2,212 tanks that crossed the Atlantic and broke a myth that 3 years of war had made seem permanent. The Pershing proved that democratic industrial capacity, when committed to a purpose, could outperform authoritarian engineering, perfectionism on every axis simultaneously. Quality and quantity, innovation and production, technical achievement and psychological impact. If you know a story like this one, a story about an ordinary person who got something right when the institution said it was impossible, tell us in the comments. There are hundreds of them buried in the archives of the Second World War, and almost none of them have been told the way they deserve to be. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story is already waiting, and it starts with a decision that made everyone in the room think the man who proposed it had lost his mind. The war was won by generals and strategists and the courage of men in combat. But it was also won by people whose names we do not know, who showed up and did the work, and trusted that getting it right was the whole point. It always is. Asterisk.